I was headhunted by Frank Lewes of Shell International to be ENGE 18 in Nigeria for 4 years. I met Richmond Johnson, and then one day, without ceremony, without trumpets, without permission from any committee, everything changed. He came into my office holding a book, a thick, respectable-looking book on corrosion, written by a professor from Middlesex University. The kind of book that sat proudly on shelves and was quoted in reports. The kind of book that passed through committees untouched by doubt. Richmond Johnson, the head of engineering for Shell BP Nigeria Development Corporation, Eastern Division, held it like a holy text. He looked at me and said, "I've been studying this and understand corrosion control. Can you explain this part? And then this part?" I looked at the pages and then looked at him. And I said quietly, "It doesn't work like that. It works like this." I showed him my wall charts. The first one, which went the whole length of one wall, was graph paper with mapping pins stuck in and threads between each pin, thus providing a moving graph. And as my team of surveyors brought the data in, I moved the pins so that this was in fact a dynamic wall chart similar to what can nowadays be achieved instantly on a computer. On the opposite wall, I pinned pieces of paper, cardboard actually, which represented the locations and the pipelines between the locations. On each, we put the relevant current readings of the surveys that were brought in from each of these nodes. We thus had on the walls of the department of the office, we had the equivalent of a computer. But in those days, computers weren't available. There was a mainframe computer in an air-cooled room, and in other places there just weren't computers. All we had at that stage were pocket calculators. And I was able to use pocket calculator to calculate the currents which were flowing through each of the pipelines to each of the nodes on the system that I put on the wall. He looked at me and said, softly, almost to himself, "Oh, this is something entirely new." To me, it wasn't new, it was logical. From that day on, Richmond Johnson started coming down to my office. Every time there was a report, every time a reading didn't make sense, every time somebody somewhere panicked about a pipe, he'd sit beside me while I watched the charts on the wall, and he'd watch me point out He'd ask the questions, I'd point to the answers, and slowly, quietly, trust began to form. And then the first leak happened. I had predicted it, not vaguely, not approximately, exactly. Richmond Johnson came into my office holding the leak report. He wouldn't tell me where it is. He said, show me. So I took him to the wall and showed him the relevant location. And he stopped. There, I said. I nodded. He stepped back and stared at me like I'd just done a magic trick. It's like magic, he said. It wasn't magic. It was physics. But something fundamental shifted in that moment. After that, he brought the head of engineering for the entire Eastern Division down to my office. He's the equivalent of CEO. His name was Bert Och, and he was a very, very highly respected engineer and head of the Eastern Division of Shell BP Development Corporation, Nigeria. He was polite, interested but not impressed, curious but cautious. Then the second leak happened. This time Bertok came down himself. He had already got hold of the report, and he dragged Richmond Johnson into my office with him. He didn't sit down. He said, "Where is it?" So I showed him. He stood there in silence for a long time. Then he said something I'll never forget. "I think you're doing this." And for the first time in my life, someone with actual power had realised what I was doing wasn't just paperwork. It was control. From that day on, we worked as a team. And just like that, I crossed an invisible line. I stopped being an engineering nobody working quietly in the background. I became someone who could get things done. Someone whose pencil moved money. Someone whose charts stopped leak. And all of it grew out of that one moment in a small office with a bad book and a good question. Later, much later, when life had twisted into strange shapes, I thought back and asked myself, how did I ever meet Richmond Johnson? And the answer was so extraordinary, it almost made me laugh. He was head of engineering. I was head of engineering section 18, corrosion control. It was inevitable. And then there was Hans Meyer, another name that would come to mean something far bigger than it had any right to do. He would later become Director of Engineering for Shell International in The Hague. Years after this, when I tried to contact him through the Shell system, he invited me to go to The Hague. Just like that, as if the world still remembered me, as if none of it had been a dream. And sometimes now, when I sit quietly and replay it all, the charts, the leaks, the offices, the boardrooms, the pipeline mud, the drunken men, the patents, the committees, the threats and the miracles, I genuinely wonder, did all of that really happen? And then there's you, listening, writing it down, as if the story waited 50 years for somebody to believe it was real.